Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the case of Oleg Wirth. To understand what happened, we must first travel to the heart of the Tomsk region, to a place called Krivosheino. It is a land defined by its extremes, a remote corner of Siberia where the horizon is often swallowed by the dense, dark green of the taiga. In the winter of 2011, the snow fell with a relentless, heavy grace, covering the world in a shroud of white that seemed as though it would never lift. The silence in Krivosheino during those months was absolute. It was a cold that did not just touch the skin, but seeped into the bones, turning the breath into thin, ghostly ribbons of frost. The village, nestled near the banks of the winding rivers, felt like an island in a sea of frozen pine and larch. Here, the passage of time is marked not by clocks, but by the thickness of the ice and the weight of the wood pile beside the stove. For the people living there, the winter is a time of indwelling, of staying close to the hearth while the wind howls through the narrow gaps in the timber walls. But beneath that deep, pristine blanket of snow, something was waiting. Something that the winter had helped to hide, and something that the coming spring was destined to reveal. As the calendar turned toward the early months of 2012, the iron grip of the Siberian winter began to soften. This is the time of the thaw, known in these parts as the Rasputitsa. It is not a gentle transition. It is a season of mud and transformation, where the frozen earth turns into a dark, viscous slurry. The air in Krivosheino changed, losing its sharp, metallic bite and replaced by the heavy scent of damp moss, old leaves, and the ancient, earthy smell of the ground waking up. You could hear it before you could see it. The rhythmic, hollow drip of melting icicles from the eaves of the wooden houses, and the distant, thunderous groaning of the river ice as it began to crack and heave. The roads, once solid and predictable, became treacherous paths of gray slush and deep, watery ruts. It was during this period of unraveling that the landscape began to give up its secrets. The snow, which had been a protective barrier for months, vanished inch by inch, receding from the edges of gardens and the shadows of outbuildings. It was a slow unveiling, a peeling back of the winter's pale skin to reveal the dark, sodden reality beneath. In the quiet corners of the district, where the trees grow thick and the shadows linger, the thaw was doing more than just bringing life back to the soil. It was exposing the remnants of a nightmare that had been quietly resting in the cold. The discovery began not with a grand gesture, but with a simple, unsettling sight in the softening mud. Imagine a local resident, perhaps clearing away the debris of the long winter or checking the boundaries of a plot of land as the afternoon light began to fail. The sun in the Tomsk region during the spring has a peculiar quality. It is pale and low, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet earth. As this person walked, the sound of their boots sinking into the saturated ground was the only noise in the stillness. Then they saw it. At first, it might have looked like a piece of weathered wood or a discarded remnant of cloth tangled in the roots. But as the thaw continued its work, the shape became undeniable. It was a hand, pale and partially preserved by the very ice that had hidden it. It was reaching out from the mud, a silent plea from the depths of the previous year. The dread did not strike all at once. It grew like a cold shiver moving up the spine. The realization that the earth beneath one's feet held such a heavy secret was enough to turn the stomach. The authorities were called, their heavy vehicles churning up the mud of Krivosheino as they arrived to witness what the melting snow had brought to the surface. This was not just an accident of nature. This was the beginning of a trail that led back through the months of darkness, straight to the door of a man who lived among them, unnoticed and seemingly ordinary. To understand the shock that rippled through the Tomsk region, one must understand the nature of Krivosheino itself. It is a place where people know their neighbors by the sound of their engines or the way they stack their wood. It is a community built on the necessity of mutual survival in a harsh climate. The idea that a killer could be walking these same muddy paths, nodding a greeting at the local store, was a poison that began to seep into the village's sense of peace. As investigators began to dig, literally and figuratively, the scope of the horror started to expand. The thaw was not finished. In other locations, near cellar doors and under the floorboards of modest homes, more secrets were waiting. The air, once filled with the promise of spring, now felt thick with the scent of decay and the weight of unanswered questions. People began to look at the quiet, unassuming men of their village with new eyes. They looked at the houses with boarded windows and the gardens that had remained unkempt through the winter. They wondered about the voices they might have heard over the wind, or the lights that stayed on far into the freezing nights of December and January. The dread was no longer a distant thing. It was as close as the damp walls of their own homes. And at the center of this growing storm of suspicion was the name that would soon be whispered with a mixture of fear and disbelief: Oleg Wirth. Oleg Wirth was not a man who commanded attention. He was 50 years old, a man of average height with a face lined by the sun and the Siberian wind. He had been a part of the landscape, as unremarkable as a fence post or a weathered barn. But as the investigators meticulously brushed away the dirt and the remaining patches of ice, they found that Wirth's life was a complex tapestry of tragedy and hidden rage. He had suffered losses that would break most men, including the death of his son, a loss that seemed to have severed his connection to the moral world. In the quiet of his home, while the rest of Krivosheino slept behind locked doors, he had been engaged in a dark ritual of violence and concealment. The bodies found in the thaw were those of people he knew, people he had shared drinks with, people who had trusted the shelter of his roof. He had used the winter as his accomplice, trusting the snow to keep his secrets until the world turned white and stayed that way. But the seasons are a cycle that cannot be stopped. The thaw in 2012 brought more than just water to the rivers of the Tomsk region. It brought a reckoning. As we continue tonight, we will go deeper into the mind of this man and the events that led to that fateful spring, exploring how a simple missing item could lead to a spree of violence that forever changed the silence of Krivosheino. For now, just listen to the sound of the melting snow and imagine the secrets it might still be hiding. The village of Urusha was a place where the earth felt older than time, a small cluster of wood and iron tucked deep within the Amur Oblast. In the final months of 2010, the air began to thicken with more than just the coming frost. Oleg Wirth, once a man of standing and the head of the local housing department, had become a shadow of his former self. The heavy, rhythmic sound of his boots on the packed snow became a familiar, unsettling cadence in the twilight hours. Following the tragic loss of his son, the grief had carved deep, jagged lines into his face, and the local pubs became his sanctuary. But as the calendar turned toward the end of that year, something shifted in the way he moved through the world. The villagers noticed it in the sharp, sudden turns he took down the narrow alleyways, and the way his eyes would linger a moment too long on the back of a neighbor's head. It was a time of quiet decay, where the smell of wood smoke and diesel fuel seemed to mask a growing, unspoken tension that settled over the rooftops like a heavy shroud of gray wool. As the winter of 2010 deepened, the vanishing path began to form, though few recognized it at the time. It started with small things, the kind of absences that a remote town easily explains away. A man from the next settlement failed to return from a supply run. A traveler was said to have simply kept walking toward the horizon. The woods surrounding Urusha were vast, a labyrinth of birch and pine that could swallow a person whole without leaving a single trace. Oleg would often be seen at the edge of these woods, his silhouette framed by the pale, dying light of a Siberian afternoon. He carried with him a heaviness that seemed to pull at the very atmosphere. People began to talk of the coldness in his home, a small, weathered structure on the outskirts where the windows remained dark even during the most celebratory nights. Inside those walls, the air was stale, smelling of old tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of tools that had been handled too many times in the dark. The community was small enough that every face was known, yet large enough that a slow, deliberate erosion of their numbers could go unrecorded by the authorities for months. By the arrival of early 2011, the unease had transformed into a physical presence. Mothers pulled their children closer when Oleg passed, not because of any single act he had committed, but because of the aura of volatility that clung to him like the smell of cheap vodka. He had met Tatiana Kuznetsova by then, a woman whose own life had been fractured by loss and the harsh realities of the Amur wilderness. Together, they occupied the fringes of the village, two people who had been discarded by the respectable world. They were often seen walking the frozen paths together, their heads bowed low against the biting wind, speaking in hushed, urgent tones that stopped the moment anyone drew near. There were whispers of late-night visitors to their home, men who sought a drink or a moment of warmth, only to never be seen again on the main streets of the village. The path to Oleg's door was becoming a one-way trail, a stretch of ground where the snow was trampled into a hard, icy glass that reflected nothing but the empty sky. The realization that a predator might be living among them did not come as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, sickening dawning, like the sun rising through a thick, poisonous fog. The spring of 2011 brought no thaw to the hearts of those who lived in the shadow of the Wirth household. As the ice began to groan and crack in the nearby rivers, the disappearances became harder to ignore. A local laborer, known for his reliability, vanished after a night of drinking with acquaintances. Another woman, a friend of Tatiana's, stopped appearing at the market. The police, stretched thin across the vast territories of the East, saw only the statistics of a hard life: accidents in the woods, people moving away for work, the inevitable casualties of the bottle. But the people of Russia knew the texture of their own silence, and that silence was growing louder. They looked at Oleg's hands, calloused and stained, and they saw a man who no longer seemed to care for the laws of the living. He possessed a prized possession, a lighter that had belonged to his late son, which he would flick open and shut with a hypnotic, metallic click. That sound became synonymous with the dread of the vanishing path. It was a countdown, though none knew exactly when the clock would strike midnight. The air in the village was charged with a static electricity of fear, a premonition that the quiet disappearances of the past year were merely the preamble to a much more violent and visible storm. The village of Russia lay like a forgotten scar across the Amur Oblast, a place where the horizon was swallowed by the endless, emerald reach of the Russian taiga. As the winter of 2011 deepened, the air became a physical weight, brittle and sharp enough to crack the very timber of the houses. In the heart of this isolation, the investigation into the disappearance of several local residents began to take a harrowing turn. The investigators who arrived in the village were greeted by a silence so profound it felt intentional. They walked through streets where the snow was piled 6 feet high, their breath blooming in thick white clouds that vanished into the freezing gray sky. To the locals, Oleg Wirth was a familiar face, the head of the housing department, a man who understood the mechanics of the village. But as the authorities began to peel back the layers of his life, they found a man who had become a ghost within his own community, a silent hunter who moved through the shadows of the forest with a terrifying, predatory patience. The forensic search of the Wirth property was a descent into a nightmare preserved in ice. Inside the small, weathered house on the outskirts of the village, the air was stagnant, carrying the faint, metallic tang of old wood smoke and something far more clinical. The investigators moved with agonizing slowness, their gloved hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of what they were uncovering. They focused their efforts on the cellar, a dark, subterranean space where the frost had crept down the stone walls like ghostly fingers. To reach the truth, they had to break through the floorboards, the rusted nails shrieking as they were pried from the wood. Below, the earth was packed hard, a tomb of frozen mud and secrets. Every shovel of dirt was an effort of will. They worked by the harsh, blue light of portable lanterns, which cast long, distorted shadows against the low ceiling. It was here, in the suffocating dampness of the underground, that the first evidence of the New Year's Eve tragedy began to emerge, revealing a brutality that the quiet exterior of the house had successfully masked for months. The scope of the search soon expanded beyond the cellar and into the unforgiving wilderness of the taiga. Tracking a killer through the Russian forest in the dead of winter is a task that defies human endurance. The search teams were comprised of men and women who had spent their lives in the north, yet even they were humbled by the terrain. The taiga is a labyrinth of birch and pine, where the snow hides deep ravines and treacherous deadfalls. They used long, slender probes to pierce the snowbank, searching for any inconsistency in the earth beneath. The wind was a constant companion, a low, morning howl that seemed to mock their progress. They followed the faint, weathered trails that Oleg had walked, imagining him moving through the trees with the same silent intent that had earned him his grim reputation. Each step was a battle against the elements, the temperatures dropping to -40 degrees, making the plastic of their equipment brittle and their own movements sluggish. The forest did not want to give up its dead, and the deeper they went, the more they realized they were searching for needles in a frozen haystack of 1,000 square miles. As the forensic teams meticulously documented the sites, they began to reconstruct the final moments of the victims. The evidence told a story of sudden, explosive violence followed by a chillingly methodical cleanup. In the cellar, they found remnants of clothing and personal effects that had been buried along with the bodies, items that had once belonged to people who considered Oleg a friend. There was a profound sense of betrayal in the very soil. The investigators had to use heaters to slowly thaw the ground, a process that took hours of patient waiting, as the smell of wet earth and decay began to fill the cramped space. They found the heavy chisel that had been used in the first 3 murders, its cold steel reflecting the lantern light. The weapon was a tool of the trade, something mundane turned into an instrument of absolute horror. Outside, the search dogs struggled, their noses burned by the extreme cold, yet they remained the only hope for finding the remains that had been carried further into the woods. The psychological toll on the team was immense. They were not just cataloging bones. They were witnessing the total disintegration of the social fabric of Russia. The investigation also had to contend with the complex presence of Tatiana Kuznetsova, whose cooperation was the key that finally turned the lock. She led the officers to the edge of the woods, her figure small and fragile against the towering pines. She spoke in a low, monotone voice, describing the nights of drinking that had turned into mornings of bloodshed. Her words painted a picture of a household ruled by a volatile mix of grief and alcohol, where a missing lighter or a stolen bottle of vodka could be a death sentence. The authorities watched her closely, noting the way she flinched at the sound of cracking branches. She showed them where the 5th victim had been taken, a spot deep in the forest where the snow seemed unnaturally smooth. As the sun began to set, casting long, violet shadows across the drifts, the searchers finally struck something hard beneath the ice. The silence of the taiga was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the shovels and the heavy, ragged breathing of the men. They had found the last of the silent hunter's secrets, a discovery that would forever change the way the people of the Amur Oblast looked at the shadows between the trees. The transition from suspicion to certainty did not happen with a sudden roar, but rather with the quiet, persistent dripping of a thaw in the dead of winter. In the village of Russia, located within the vast and often unforgiving stretches of the Amur Oblast, silence was not merely a lack of sound. It was a physical presence. By the time 2012 began to unfold, the investigators were no longer looking for a shadow moving through the woods, but were instead narrowing their focus onto a single, unassuming doorway. The air in the village during those months was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, a heavy atmosphere that seemed to cling to the wooden fences and the frost-covered windows of the small homes. This was a place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, yet a profound darkness had managed to take root right in the center of the community, hidden behind a facade of weary respectability. The path leading to Oleg Wirth was paved with the mundane details of a life that, on the surface, appeared entirely unremarkable. He was a man of the community, a man who walked the same dirt paths and breathed the same frigid air as everyone else. Yet beneath that layer of normalcy, the machinery of a predator had begun to grind with a terrifying consistency. Oleg Wirth was not a man who stood out in a crowd. Born in 1967, he had reached a point in his life where he was seen as a fixture of the local landscape. He held a position of responsibility, serving as the head of the local housing and communal services department. To the people of Russia, he was the man who kept the village functioning, the one who understood the inner workings of their pipes and their heaters. There was a certain weight to his presence, a gravity born from a personal tragedy that the villagers whispered about with a mix of pity and distance. Years earlier, he had lost his adult son in an accident, an event that had hollowed him out in ways that were visible only in the sudden sharpness of his gaze or the way he lingered over his drinks. This grief became the dark soil in which his impulses grew. He began to drink heavily, a slow descent that transformed him from a grieving father into a man of volatile, unpredictable rages. The villagers saw the drinking as a symptom of his loss, a tragic but understandable flaw. They did not see the way his hands would tremble with a different kind of energy when the sun went down, or the way he looked at his acquaintances not as friends, but as obstacles or targets in a game only he was playing. The subtle clues began to coalesce around a small, weathered house on the outskirts of the village. It was a structure that seemed to huddle against the elements, its wooden planks grayed by years of exposure. Inside, the air was often thick with the smell of stale tobacco and cheap, potent alcohol. It was here, during the final hours of 2011, that the first crack in the foundation of his secret life appeared. A New Year's Eve gathering, meant to be a celebration among friends, spiraled into a nightmare over something as trivial as a missing lighter. This was not just any lighter. It was a keepsake from his deceased son, a small piece of metal that held the entire weight of his remaining humanity. When it vanished from the table, something snapped within Oleg. The search for this object became an interrogation, and the interrogation became a slaughter. He took up a chisel, a cold and heavy tool meant for construction, and used it to end the life of a man he had called a friend only hours before. When the others in the room woke to the sound of the struggle, he did not hesitate. He moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency, silencing the witnesses one by one. The sensory details of that night were etched into the mind of Tatiana Kuznetsova, who watched from the shadows of the room, her breath hitching in her throat as the man she thought she knew became a butcher in the dim light of a single bulb. As 2012 progressed, the weight of the secrets buried beneath the house began to strain the very air in the village. Oleg had managed to hide the bodies in the cellar, a dark and cramped space where the smell of rot was masked by the natural odors of a damp foundation. In March of that year, as the ground began to soften, he performed the gruesome task of digging out the remains to rebury them deeper, a task he carried out with a chilling lack of emotion. Tatiana remained by his side, trapped in a cycle of fear and complicity that tasted like copper and felt like ice. The breakthrough for the authorities did not come from forensic brilliance or a sudden slip-up by Wirth, but from the slow erosion of Tatiana's spirit. She watched him kill again in June, over a stolen bottle of alcohol, and then again in the woods on the outskirts of the village. Each act was more casual than the last, a terrifying progression that showed him for what he truly was. The net began to close when the terror finally outweighed her loyalty. She realized that she was not a partner, but a witness whose time was eventually going to run out. The quiet resident of Russia, the man who managed their housing and fixed their utilities, was walking a path that would inevitably lead to her own grave if she did not act. On the morning of September 30th, 2012, the facade finally crumbled. The air was crisp, the sky a flat, unblinking gray as Tatiana made the long, agonizing walk to the local police station. Every footstep on the gravel seemed to echo with the names of the missing. When she spoke, the story she told was so horrific, so at odds with the public image of Oleg Wirth, that the officers initially struggled to process the scale of the betrayal. But as they approached the small house on the outskirts, the reality began to settle in. They found Wirth there, a man who had surrendered to his own darkness long ago. He did not offer a fight. Instead, he led them to the cellar, to the soft earth that held the proof of his crimes. As the investigators began the grim task of recovery, the silence of Russia was finally broken by the sound of shovels striking the dirt. The clues had been there all along, hidden in the grief of a father, the violence of an alcoholic, and the fear of a woman who had seen too much. The net had closed, not with a grand chase, but with the opening of a cellar door and the realization that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who live right next door, walking the same paths and sharing the same quiet village life. The heavy tires of the police vehicles crunched against the frostbitten gravel of the village road, a sound like dry bones snapping in the hollow quiet of the morning air. It was September 30th, 2012, and the village of Russia was held in the grip of a seasonal transition that felt more like a slow, gasping breath. The station was a small, unassuming structure, its pale walls stained by years of soot and the harsh Amur climate. But inside, the atmosphere had thickened into something suffocating. Oleg Wirth sat in the center of the interrogation room, a space defined by the hum of a flickering fluorescent tube and the smell of industrial cleaner masking something much older and more sour. He did not look like the monster the village would soon come to know. He looked like a man made of gray shadows and worn fabric. His hands, large and calloused from years of labor, rested on the cold metal surface of the table, as still as the earth beneath his cellar floor. Across from him, the investigators waited, their breath misting slightly in the unheated room. They watched the way he didn't blink, the way he seemed to be listening to a sound that no one else could hear, as if the silence of the woods followed him even into this cage of brick and wire. The light above them was clinical and unforgiving, casting deep, cavernous shadows beneath Oleg's brow. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a roar, but a low, dry rasp, like the rustle of dead leaves under a heavy boot. He began with the night that the world ended for those who entered his home, New Year's Eve, 2011. The village had been draped in a thick, suffocating blanket of white, the kind of cold that turns the lungs to glass. Inside his small house on the outskirts, the air had been thick with the fumes of cheap alcohol and the smell of burning wood. He described the 3 guests who had been there, 2 men and a woman, faces blurred by the haze of a long, desperate celebration. He told the investigators about the moment the warmth turned to ice. He had reached for his lighter, a small, silver object, a keepsake from his son who had been lost to an accident years before. It was the only thing he had left that carried the weight of a memory he still cherished. When he couldn't find it, a primal, jagged rage tore through the fog of his intoxication. He was certain one of them had stolen it, pocketing his last connection to the boy. He didn't ask for it back. He didn't argue. He simply reached for a chisel, a tool meant for shaping wood, and turned it into an instrument of absolute silence. The details spilled from him with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. He described the weight of the chisel in his hand, the way the metal felt biting into his palm as he struck. One by one, the 3 guests were extinguished in the dim light of the kitchen. He spoke of the blood, dark and steaming against the cold floorboards, and the way the house seemed to grow larger and more empty with every heartbeat that stopped. He told the investigators how he had first dragged the bodies into the dark, damp mouth of the cellar. But the fear of discovery had prickled at the back of his neck like a cold needle. Under the cover of a moonless, freezing night, he moved them into the yard, burying them beneath layers of garbage and the relentless, drifting snow. He lived with them there, just outside his door, for months. When the spring thaw began to soften the ground in March of 2012, and the smell of the earth began to change, he dug them up once more. He returned them to the cellar, tamping down the dirt with a shovel until the floor looked as undisturbed as a grave in a forgotten churchyard. He spoke of this labor as if he were describing the planting of a garden, his voice devoid of any tremor or regret. But the tally did not end in the winter frost. Oleg leaned forward, the cold light catching the jagged lines of his face as he moved into the heat of June, 2012. He described a late afternoon where the air was heavy with the scent of pine and the hum of insects. He had been drinking again, this time with a friend and Tatiana. A bottle of alcohol, purchased with his own dwindling coins, had gone missing. The betrayal felt the same as the stolen lighter, a sharp, stinging insult that required a permanent answer. He told the detectives how he had pulled a knife, the blade catching the stray beams of sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. He didn't just kill the man. He commanded Tatiana to join him, to bind her to the act with the same steel. They watched the life drain away into the floorboards, another secret added to the weight beneath their feet. The fifth victim followed only a day later. This man had been a friend too, but he had begun to ask questions, his voice carrying the dangerous weight of suspicion. He wanted to know where the others had gone. Oleg led him into the deep, emerald shadows of the forest on the edge of the village. The woods were thick there, the moss damp and absorbing all sound. Under the canopy of ancient trees, the sixth murder was committed, the body left to be claimed by the brambles and the quiet rot of the wilderness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon outside the station, casting long, bruised streaks of purple and orange across the sky, Oleg Wirth agreed to lead them back to the house. The air was turning sharp again, the wind whispering through the dry grass of the Amur plains. When they arrived at the small, weathered shack, the silence was different than before. It was heavy, expectant, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The investigators followed him into the dim interior, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, revealing the peeling wallpaper and the layers of dust that coated every surface. Oleg pointed a steady finger toward the cellar door, a heavy slab of wood that groaned on its hinges as it was pulled back. The smell hit them first, a thick, cloying mixture of damp earth, old rot, and the metallic tang of something that had never truly been cleansed. They descended into the dark, their boots sinking into the soft, uneven soil. As they began to dig, the reality of Oleg's words took physical form. One by one, the remains were uncovered, pulled from the cold embrace of the dirt. The light of the investigators' lamps reflected off the wet earth and the pale remnants of lives cut short. Oleg stood at the edge of the pit, watching with an expression of profound, hollow calm, as if he were finally shedding a skin he had worn for far too long. The courtroom in the heart of the region felt as though it had been carved from the very ice of the Siberian winter. It was a space of high, vaulted ceilings and heavy, dark timber that seemed to soak up the hushed whispers of those who gathered within its walls. The air was thick with the scent of old floor wax and the faint, metallic tang of the radiator pipes as they groaned under the pressure of the freezing morning. Outside, the sun was a pale, silver coin hanging low in a sky of bruised lavender, casting long and spindly shadows across the snow-covered streets. For the people of Krivisheno, this was the day they had waited for through many long, sleepless nights. They sat in the wooden pews, their heavy coats smelling of wood smoke and damp wool, their eyes fixed on the iron cage where Oleg Wirth sat. He remained perfectly still, a shadow within a shadow, his hands resting on his knees like stones. The silence in the room was not empty. It was a heavy, physical thing, pressing down on the shoulders of every person present. It was the silence of a village that had lost its peace, a community that had seen the unthinkable bloom in the darkness of the taiga. As the judge began to speak, the only other sound was the steady, rhythmic scratching of a pen against paper. The words were read slowly, falling like heavy drops of water into a deep well. The court revisited the details of the years 2011 and 2012, tracing the movements of a man who had once been seen as a quiet neighbor, a worker, a father. The narrative was a grim tapestry of 5 lives lost, woven with threads of senseless anger and dark secrets. The judge spoke of the small house on the outskirts of the village, a place where hospitality had turned into a nightmare. He detailed the catalyst for the first tragedy, a missing lighter, a simple keepsake from a deceased son that had sparked a fire of rage in Oleg's mind. The listeners in the courtroom closed their eyes as the descriptions of the cellar were read aloud. The cold, earthen floor where the remains of acquaintances had been hidden, the quiet earth of the garden that held secrets for months on end. Every mention of the items involved, the knives, the alcohol, the shifting of the bodies in the month of March, seemed to make the room grow colder, until the frost on the windows seemed to creep further toward the center of the glass. Tatiana Kuznetsova sat beside the guards, her head bowed so low that her hair shielded her face from the gaze of the public. She was a woman whose life had been fractured by hardship long before she met Oleg, and now the court addressed her role in the shadows. The judge spoke of the influence Oleg held over her, but also of the choices made in the heat of the moment. When the verdict was finally reached, the air seemed to vanish from the room for a heartbeat. For the murders of 5 people, for the desecration of the peace of the taiga, Oleg Wirth was sentenced to life imprisonment in a special regime colony. He would spend the rest of his days within the confines of stone and steel, far from the whispering pines of the forest. Tatiana was sentenced to 13 years, a long stretch of time that would see the world change many times over before she breathed free air again. Oleg's reaction was a sharp, sudden outburst, a denial that echoed against the wooden panels, but it was a sound that had no power here. The law had spoken, and the heavy iron doors of justice were beginning to swing shut. In the months and years that followed 2012, the village of Krivisheno began the slow, painful process of remembering how to feel safe. But the taiga is a place that holds onto its echoes. The forest that surrounds the village is vast and ancient, a sea of green and gray that watches the movements of men with a cold indifference. For the families of the 5 who were lost, the closure offered by the court was a small comfort compared to the vastness of their grief. They would still see the shadows moving between the birch trees at dusk, and they would still feel a shiver when the wind howled through the eaves of their homes. The psychological impact was like a fine layer of ash that had settled over the town, dulling the colors of everyday life. Neighbors looked at one another with a lingering question in their eyes, wondering how well one can truly know the person living next door. The house on the outskirts stood empty for a long time, its windows like sightless eyes, until the elements began to reclaim it, the wood rotting slowly and the garden becoming choked with weeds and wildflowers. Nature, it seemed, was the only thing capable of truly burying the past. As we reach the end of this journey into the depths of the Siberian wilderness, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a great, quiet expanse. The story of Oleg Wirth is one of profound darkness, but it is also a reminder of the resilience of those who remain. The names of the lost are whispered by the wind in the needles of the cedar trees, a soft and constant memory that the earth refuses to forget. The sun has set now over the village, and the stars are beginning to pierce through the velvet blue of the night sky. The world is vast, and though there is shadow, there is also the warmth of the hearth and the safety of the light. Let the weight of the story lift from your mind now. The gavel has fallen, the cell has been locked, and the taiga has returned to its long, snowy sleep. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.